Welcome to our series on how public sector and critical infrastructure leaders can better detect and respond to cyber threats by taking new approaches to security operations. As cybersecurity attacks continue to increase in number and severity, it's essential to stay current not only in the latest technology solutions, but also the best operating practices. I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and joining us to talk about understanding both the economic and operational impacts of security breaches are Lewis Evans, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Arctic Wolf Networks, and cybersecurity expert Dennis Chow. Lewis and Dennis, thank you so much for joining us. And Lewis, I'm going to start with you. As cyber attacks continue to evolve, the damage they create continue to grow, right? So there are direct costs and there are hidden costs, and there, when data breaches occur, it can really be damaging in a lot of ways. So obviously, the job of IT and security professionals is to keep those costs from occurring. But what do organizations do if the nightmare of breaches occurs?
Yeah, Wyatt, I'm really glad that we're here asking this question today, and I'm excited to be joined by Dennis and to get the benefit of his expertise as well, because I think that this is a really crucial question. And oddly enough, for organizations and teams that are dedicated to preventing this sort of catastrophic outcome, we see that it's surprisingly common. Not pointing any fingers, not naming any names, but it's surprisingly common for IT teams and leadership to lack perspective on the full set of impacts that they're going to experience in the event of a cyber incident, and therefore, not being able. Therefore, these teams find themselves in a position to be unable to scope their defense and their response appropriately, and that can lead to underinvestment in security. It can lead to misallocated effort, and certainly in the event, unfortunately, of an incident, which is something that we always try to reduce the likelihood, but we can never drive to zero. Again, that lack of analysis in advance, that lack of foresight can put organizations on the back foot in terms of responding. So I'm really excited to talk about this, and I'd love to dive right into some of the breakdowns.
Well, Dennis, I like what Lewis suggested there, is that organizations don't always think about the full impact. So let's say an incident does happen. Following an incident, could you describe what kinds of costs organizations should really expect near and longer term, and maybe how to prepare for that?
Yeah, thanks, Wyatt. I'm in agreement with Lewis. The issues are they don't compartmentalize the analysis of said assessments or breaches or previous incident response assessments from either themselves or third parties. And what I would like to say is they really need to break it down into 4 different pillars. One, administration and PR, which really comes down to comms, stakeholders, things like opportunity costs, talent costs. There's also litigation costs that they might have accounted for, but maybe not in full. So things like retainers for outside specializations, third-party costs for restoration of downstream, additional consumer items, so credit monitoring, compliance violations, and even legal items, depending on the region and the type of data they use. I really think they really focus too much heavily on technical related costs. So incident response, the digital forensics, maybe even retainership of a third-party digital forensics group. And a lot of IT and cloud ops related restoration is what they're really accounting for in the heat of the moment. But in the last pillar, I think is where they don't touch on nearly as much that they could do. It's really insurance costs, things like third-party payment needs, deductible costs, such as the T-Mobile breach of 2022 from that court ruling. What is the max payout, and are you third-party covered for policies and data breaches as a whole? Different insurance carriers have different items, including catastrophic bonds, shifting risk to investors. So those are things I think that could really help out. And to Lewis' point again, enough planning and foresight will go a long way towards that.
Yeah, Dennis, I'm glad. I think that's a great sort of top level breakdown of what's happening there. And the point that I would like to emphasize, on the heels of that, is that each of those categories can be a lot bigger than organizations expect to begin with. So just taking the litigation example, it's probably easy for an IT expert who's thinking a lot about the technical remediation process, the sort of specialties to bring in there, to sort of have penciled in their mind or in a document, well, it's a lawyer, and That's certainly not the case. I spend a lot of time working with people who are involved in this sort of full stack business facing incident response work. That's many different lawyers, a bunch of different retainers, a lot of different specialties. We work with small organizations where like probably my costs scale down if I have a smaller breach. For engaging a legal team with a wide range of expertise, there's a real floor there of a bunch of different individuals, highly qualified teams that have to be engaged. So you in each of these, there's sort of an explosion of complexity that can often be concealed by a simple, like a single box in a planning exercise, even in a planning exercise, and candidly, if you're conducting a serious multi-stakeholder planning exercise about breach response, you're probably ahead of the median there. But unless you really have unless you really have the sort of comprehensive set of stakeholders and you're going into each one of these, it can be really easy to assume that the costs are low because the activity is oh, we'll just call our PR team. Well, if you bring in the head of your outside PR firm or you bring in your own head of comms, they'll say, absolutely not. We would need to engage a crisis firm. Here are some retainer price points for that crisis firm. Here's the extra payment we would have to make them because to this firm because it's going to be an urgent matter. You bring in your legal team, you say, well, we have lawyers on staff, right? Surely we can handle that. Like certainly that's not the case. And I think you get this sort of explosion or proliferation of complexity. And then to look at that from the highest end, there's a sort of an increasing body of research on the public markets impact of cyber breaches that shows that this whole universe can add up to sort of mid to low single digit impacts on total company valuation over meaningful license. It's when you say low single digit % impact, that sounds like a low number, but I assure you, if you're talking to someone who is concerned about company valuation numbers, that is a catastrophically huge number. That is the sort of thing that they think about a lot, and that a great deal of investment is worth to mitigate or to handle. And then I guess just the final note I would make on it is that each of these cost areas can be by understanding them in advance. First of all, you're able to scope effectively, but second of all, with that knowledge or with that planning, when you do hit an incident, you're often able to contain these cost centers dramatically. And again, it's a really a really basic level of planning and of scoping can go a long way in the event of an incident. The difference between a team that thinks, well, we'll call up our own legal team and we have lawyers on staff and they can handle it, versus a team that simply has the phone number of a firm that specializes in this area. That's a real impact on incident response timelines to a business, and that's a real impact on the scope of an incident, the scope of damage that an incident is able to cause to a business. And that I keep sort of jumping for the lawyer example just because it was at the top of the list, but that pattern replicates itself across each of the categories that Dennis referred to.
Yeah, well, I like your description of explosion of complexity, because I'm sure that's what's involved in multiple layers. So just briefly, can you discuss, like, how does an organization go about making sure they're actually prepared to weather the storm and really shoulder the full total cost of a data breach? And Dennis, maybe I'll go with you and we'll get back to Lewis as well.
Yeah, I hate to say it, lessons learned often comes from a prior breach. I think a lot of customers that I've seen get lucky. They might have a denial of service, they may have a simple phishing campaign, and they successfully isolated it. That is the time when we need to go ahead and do the planning and foresight, but also think about what we're going to do. A lot of firms that I see, especially Fortune 500s, they'll stop at tabletop exercises. And what Lewis mentioned earlier, the explosion of complexity, the where you're using your resources for your cost allocations, that really gets exponentially increased depending on how much you decide to simulate things. It's not adversarial simulation only. You have to also go through the response. So companies that are still on-premise or hybrid and that are not cloud native, they tend to have the biggest majority of I wouldn't say blockers, but people delays. And those delays are because the cost and the complexity around the response aspect and the whole simulation really goes out the door here. And that's when I feel that customers really need to dig in rather than give up. And to answer more succinctly your question on the full total cost, are they prepared? I would say no. They kind of stop at this tabletop, and I really want them to push forward. I don't know, Louis, do you have any other ideas about things they could probably do better, even at a cost conscious kind of entity?
Yeah, I think I think you're completely right. And I think that, again, for a lot of the smaller organizations we talk to, a tabletop is a great next step that we want them to get to. But that's certainly not the end of the road. And I think that, maybe the world of backup is the technical domain that illustrates this most clearly. There are a lot of teams out there with a backup plan and with all the data they need stored on backup. And even with, sort of a detailed expected execution for what restoration would look like. But if they're not doing an exercise where they're actually restoring for backup, they don't have the confidence that the plan will correspond to what their team will be able to execute in the real world, right? And obviously this is a bigger ask, right? The more a rehearsal exercise resembles an actual incident, the more disruptive it's going to be, and the bigger a lift it's going to be for an organization. So some of it is about what the IT stakeholders are prepared to ask from the business, and there's a bit of a circular relationship there, right? We'll do this exercise to show how devastating it would be. Why do we need to do this exercise? Say the other stakeholders, well, because of how devastating it is. So that can be a tricky, start from zero problem to overcome. But I think as you continue to push these exercises, sort of always in the direction of greater realism. A story I hear about, or an example I hear about a lot is, for example, tabletop exercises, you get all of the key stakeholders who are responsible in the room, and then you say, oh no, we've had an incident. Cyber attackers love to exploit times when they know that the primary corporate team is at home, like a long weekend has just started, and really doing that exercise, you say, asking these sort of like deeply pragmatic questions of, okay, here's the shared document on our server with the plan. What if the attackers have locked out access to that digital resource? Or, okay, the plan is that our in-house SME who's built up the backup system themselves is going to come in and they know it like the back of their hand, and they're going to run the restore, right? Like now they're on vacation. Now their phone is off. Well, hopefully those sorts of people tend to have pagers that are all the way on. But okay, their pager's on and they're driving an hour to the office in the midst of this incident. So I think that there's a lot of sort of pushing toward increased verisimilitude. And again, this sort of question about what does what can we actually execute against the plan as we categorized it, right? Like, what would it take to call up, okay, here's the number for the legal counsel. Have we ever called them? Do we know what happens when that phone rings? Is that, an accurate representation? And for a lot of those, you're going to get, again, when you do these sort of disaster simulations, disaster recovery practice exercises, a lot of those answers are going to be positive. That'll just be good, right? We have the right number, phone rings, on the second ring, someone picks up, they've got a well-staffed team on their end. But when you find, every unchallenged assumption is another place where that friction can leak into the response. And the friction certainly has a real tendency to compound. So that would be just what I would add there.
Yeah. And Dennis, I know Louis suggested a little earlier what the kind of estimated costs of a data breach could be if impacted both short and long term in terms of the impact on the capitalization of companies and so forth. So Dennis, I'm curious, what are you hearing, particularly as we continue to hear the cost of cyber insurance keeps escalating, you have to jump through more hoops. So what's happening on the cost front, both to prepare and if an incident happens, what executives and the board should consider as the potential long-term cost?
Sure. Let I guess I'll caveat this with that. Some of this is different depending on your industry and your customer size. A lot of customers I've worked with, both in the Fortune 500 space as well as the SMB levels. So I would say negate the idea that you're ever going to have something under, under $20,000 a year. I know there's advertisements out there from different insurance firms, and that there's like this idea that cyber insurance is something you buy and that's it. Really, it's a all-inclusive cost of a proper IR, proper DR, to lose this point, also the cyber simulations and that cadence, and having to meet that area of criteria for sustaining that policy. And so when you add them all together, companies that I've seen in the TOLA area with oil and gas specifically, even the smaller firms were paying upwards of $100,000 to $200,000 for their averages, even for the smallest breaches, because they have partnership issues. They have downstream stakeholders that they typically have integrated technologies with. So all things combined, those really add up. For your larger customers on the industry spectrum, 2022, Verizon had a data breach report. They actually elevated that from roughly 3.8 million to something around 4.2 million on average. And this really gets to be, in my opinion, that's a really small number compared to these large, very large companies. So I would say it's easily for every record, and I say record from a data breach, not just a breach by itself from a compromise of a host, but a data record, it's easily a 1 to 25 ratio based on my anecdotal consultations and whatnot. So I can't give an exact number, but I can say it's going to be more than a few members of your team in terms of cost, and you should put money aside for that accordingly each quarter if you can. Louis, did you have any other thoughts on
I think that was first of all, I think that was a great summary of where we are. I think the trend that I've been watching for a number of years now in the market is that for I would say maybe a decade ago, the idea of security operations and cyber insurance were sort of seen in opposition to each other, and you saw a lot of teams thinking, well, I can choose path A or path B about how to mitigate my risk, and those paths are converging. We are in a world where every security vendor is going to recommend that you carry the appropriate cyber insurance, and cyber insurers are going to expect a level of security practice and discipline in order to write a policy. So that's the major one. Those numbers sound like the sort of things that I've been seeing. Mm-hmm. And yeah, no, I think that's a great summary.
Yeah. Well, wrapping up, maybe both of you could just briefly describe, so what are the best options right now? I know organizations, it all depends on where they're at and where they need to be, but briefly, what solutions can they implement to, number one, better understand the benefits, costs, and risks specifically associated with breach preparedness and response times? Louis, maybe you could take that first and we'll wrap up with Dennis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of solutions, for mitigating breach costs, there's a lot of interesting development in the security operations space. A lot of stuff that we're working on and that other organizations are working on to allow companies to detect and respond to incidents faster, to mitigate the kind of vulnerabilities that are often in place, and then also to hit the ground running with incident response, because being caught flat-footed or being caught on the back foot there can be so devastating. When it comes to solutions for understanding the sort of full universe of cost, there's some interesting public sector resources, or not public sector, publicly available resources. A lot of insurers do put out data about the scope of claims they have, the different cost areas that can really sort of trigger stuff. I know that we here at Arctic Wolf have also worked on a number of web-based calculators, that sort of thing. That's sort of very that's a very appetizer course approach to understanding the full dynamics of risk. And I would say, in order to understand the full universe of risk and the possible economic scale of a serious breach or a serious incident, it really there isn't a substitute for a cross-stakeholder internal exercise. And what we find with a lot of these sort of public, or I worked on a couple of these projects, what we found was, it's easy to quantify, or easy. It's easy to at least benchmark or ballpark the kind of cost impacts that are common across organizations, and it's almost impossible for anyone outside an organization to understand the specific impacts they have. I think Dennis alluded to, business partnerships, upstream, downstream business relationships. Those kind of questions are just so difficult from the outside to answer or to even guess at. But it's the sort of thing that when IT stakeholders are able to sit down with business stakeholders and make them understand, sort of in the most concrete sense what a breach would look like, that you can get to it right away. So if I'm talking to your company and I'm saying, what is your business, alliance impact? That's something I can't ballpark for you. But if you can sit down with an executive who owns a relationship like that, or an executive in the finance department, say, our major supplier is going to decline to work with us for 6 months because they don't trust our systems. Like you can immediately connect to that. And often that sort of specific understanding of what a breach scenario would look like, A, can represent a huge slice of the total economic pain in the event of an actual incident. And B, is going to be a lot more meaningful internally than, we went to this analyst report, here's an average cost number across our industry, that sort of thing. It's real. I don't discourage using that. I've worked on some projects that do it. But in terms of establishing those stakes internally, I would say that understanding the scenario of what would happen, understanding a couple of the key business impacts in common, non-technical, not even necessarily financial language, and being able to share that to across stakeholders and across the leadership team is going to really scope out an incident and help organizations as a whole right-size their investment and response.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then Dennis, anything else that you'd add to what Louis suggested there?
I think Louis covered a lot of great points there. I want to give it for maybe some of the tactical teams listening into this panel. It's not just the CISOs, but how do you tactically put in what Louis's strategy mentioned? And it's great, right? So red teaming, you typically have a pen test or TVM team. Start with some of that, right? Get some of the actual risk involved. Scores are fine. Also calculate the average cost of two things: what cost of OpEx for your total headcount, and how many people need to be involved on the average response. On the upstream and downstream side and partnerships, right? You also typically have skill numbers based on each quarter. Maybe average out some of the percentage of what your actual throughput looks like. Either in the cloud, it's really easy for building costs, or on premise, do your best to try to utilize the last known, perhaps ticketing system like ServiceNow users, Jira, et cetera, and really get that going for your understanding for quantifying that cost there relative to risk. The next item I want to make sure you do to actually implement that is make sure you align it to your, for those of you in management, OKRs and KPIs, right? So as you report these each quarter, report progress and report what you want to focus on the next steps. Those are really great ways to say, I need a set of money based on the actual income that we have and actual estimates that we receive from our tactical needs to the next fiscal year. Automate wherever you can. Automate. So things like use your BI team, for instance. So make use of your data warehouses. Use visualizations that make sense, but also think about your SOAR and SIM platforms. Could you bring metrics out of there based on the actual response? Simulate items, test, use your red teams. And so when you combine all those together, you can really make a great picture, even without having a formalized assessment, whether it be internally or externally, and you can make your real case from there. And of course, consult with legal and compliance because they could have some additional numbers or figures that you didn't expect. And then go in there with a unified front. And those are my recommendations based on customers I've seen over the years in different industries, regardless of what your size was.
I just want to say, Dennis, that answer was a week-long consulting engagement packed in 5 minutes there. That's fantastic. Yes. I hope that the folks listening to this are taking careful notes and don't be afraid to hit that replay button if you missed even one of those sentences, because that was gold all the way through.
Absolutely. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Louis Evans and Dennis Chow, thank you so much for sharing your insights and observations about understanding not only the economic impact, but really the operational impacts of data breaches. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.